All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 12, Section 2, African Americans in the Antebellum United States. So Section 12-1, we looked more at the economics of cotton. And of course, this shift in the South into a cotton-based economy had a huge impact on slavery. We said two things that happened: the number of slaves increased as a result of cotton, and also slavery shifted, right? Mainly from the upper South, Virginia and Maryland, shifted down to the deep South. We might also say shifted / spread. And so by the time of the Civil War, slavery has gotten to places like Texas, Missouri, Louisiana, where it had not been or didn't exist really in significant numbers in the early 1800s. In this chapter, we're going to look a little bit more at what sort of impact does this actually have on slaves themselves, specifically the African American population. And one of the terms that I want to introduce here is this term paternalism, because this was an ideology, an idea that whites used, specifically slave owners, to justify slavery. Paternalism is essentially the idea that owners, quote unquote, took care of their slaves. And so this was one way that they could justify what was the actual reality of slavery, which was held together by both psychological and physical punishment, as you can see in the image inputted in your textbook here. Slavery was an institution that was held together by the threat of physical force, and in fact, physical force itself. Nonetheless, slaves resisted. They sabotaged often the plantation owners' profit. Sabotaging the plantation was day-to-day. We sometimes call this day-to-day resistance. Which could be anything from purposely breaking tools, just working very slowly, letting the livestock get away and run free. Anything that you can do on a day-to-day basis to resist was done by slaves in the United States. Additionally, there were two very important cornerstones for slave culture and life: family and religion. Religion was mostly a blend of traditional African beliefs, which had been passed down from generation to generation, plus some sort of Christianity, which by the time of the Civil War, pretty much all African Americans in the United States, including slaves, practiced some version or some form of Christianity, often blended with traditional African beliefs that were held and passed on from generation down to generation. Same thing with marriage and family. Marriage and family were incredibly important. Legally speaking, marriages were not recognized. Right. Legally speaking, marriages were not recognized, but that didn't really determine the reality. In fact, there were many slaves who were married, many slaves who had families. While most of the African American population in the South was enslaved, there did exist a free black population, we might say. I don't know if the statistics are perfect on this, but we might say that at the time of the Civil War, there were anywhere between 3.5 and 4.5 million slaves. Maybe somewhere around the ballpark of 500,000 free blacks. So I don't know exactly what percentage that is, but that's kind of roughly what I recall what the demographics broke down to. And contrary to what we might think, most free blacks actually lived in the South, specifically the upper South, where during the time of the American Revolution, again, the upper South is places like Virginia. During the time of the American Revolution, manumission laws really swept across that area. Manumission was when slave owners willingly let their slaves go free. A good example of this was George Washington. George Washington wrote in his will that once he and his wife dies, his slaves would become free, and in fact they did. And so because a lot of slaves had gotten their freedom via manumission, specifically in the Upper South, you did have a significant free black population there. However, that's not to say that the free blacks were viewed as equal counterparts to white citizens. In fact, oftentimes there were discriminatory laws against black citizens of the United States, and that to some degree it was also a matter of one's skin color, that if you were light enough. So for example, here's an image that sort of illustrates this. You have an African mother and an African child, but she has a little bit more of a lighter complexion and therefore would face less cases of discrimination. Oftentimes it was just a matter of, could you pass for a white person? Was your skin light enough in that way? And because you had maybe not a significant number of interracial children who were born in the Upper South, you certainly had a number of them. These two things went hand in hand with one another in those societies. However, though, like I mentioned before, most African Americans were enslaved, and because of the nature of cotton, this 3.5 to 4.5 million number, most of those would be working in the cotton fields. And one way of resisting was revolt, right? Revolt is to use violence to fight back against an institution in slavery that used violence itself. However, in the United States specifically, there is a distinction that we need to make, and that is the occurrence of slave revolts versus the fear of slave revolts. And the truth is, or one of the facts is, that slave revolts were not as common as the fear of slave revolts. And oftentimes it was the latter, right? It was the fear of slave revolts that often caused action. Now, there were a lot of different reasons as to why you didn't have as many violent uprisings in the United States as perhaps other slave societies around the Atlantic. One of the reasons is that slave revolts pretty much, they always failed. They were essentially suicide missions. They were easier and more, maybe not easier, but there were smarter ways to resist. Running away, for example, was a much more effective way of resisting, because in the United States it was often hard to get large numbers of slaves together. It was so spread out. It was much more rural than a place like, Haiti or Jamaica or Cuba or something like that. But they did occur, and I'm just going to mention two here. In New Orleans in 1811, you had, I think, approximately 300 slaves revolt. Like most other slave revolts in the U.S., pretty much all participants were killed, and any of those associated with it were captured, executed, or banished or expelled from the area. Nat Turner's revolt in 1831, this is probably the most infamous slave revolt in U.S. history. Certainly is the most violent, right? Violence. Anywhere, and I don't know the exact numbers, but anywhere from 40 to 60 whites were killed. And Nat Turner was somebody who was inspired by Christianity, the idea of the end of days. He was a very kind of controversial preacher or preaching figure, and he led slaves on a revolt and more or less a violent terror. Much like other revolts in the United States, Nat Turner and all those associated with the revolt were captured, executed, or banished from the area. And what these things did, right, the real sort of significance of these revolts was that they had led to a greater fear and then led to more strict laws regarding slavery. So one example is that maybe before 1831, a lot of slave owners encouraged their slaves to become preachers and to learn Christianity. After 1831, you had a lot more laws that were against that did not want to see slaves becoming preachers and preaching a message that was potentially harmful, right, to the slave owners. Lastly, we'll talk a little bit more about this interstate slave trade. Remember, and we just covered this last section, the transatlantic slave trade was banned in 1808, although some smuggling did occur. The largest internal migration, or one of the largest internal migrations in the United States, was this shift from the upper South to the lower South. We sometimes call this the second middle passage, right? So the second middle passage is the trip slaves, or actually let's do this, the forced migration of slaves from the upper South to the deep South. And one way that this had a profound impact on the lives of slaves was that the second middle passage tore families apart. And in fact, probably one of the most egregious parts to this cotton boom was the fact that not only had slavery grown in terms of the number of people enslaved, not only had it spread over a number of areas, but fathers and daughters were torn apart, husbands and wives were torn apart, brothers and sisters were torn apart. It absolutely decimated the family, which was such an integral and important role to the lives of slaves leading up to this cotton boom. Places like New Orleans, of course, became a major exporting city, in addition to an area where slave markets were held. Slave markets or auctions. Should be you in there. Here's a picture from your textbook showing one of the slave auctions, where no doubt ones would be torn apart from their family. And of course, because of cotton, slaves were in high demand.